Espresso. The entire modern coffee world was built on a single small shot. Espresso is made by forcing hot water through finely ground coffee under high pressure, producing a concentrated liquid topped with a layer of thick golden foam called crema. The word is Italian and translates to pressed out. Italy developed espresso in the early 20th century as cafe owners searched for faster ways to serve customers during busy hours. Many Italians still drink it standing at the bar in 2 or 3 quick sips, treating it less like a beverage and more like a daily ritual that takes about 40 seconds. Americano. The story behind the Americano is one of the more entertaining ones in coffee history. American soldiers stationed in Italy during World War II found traditional espresso far too intense compared to the mild drip coffee they grew up drinking, so they started diluting it with hot water to make it more familiar. Italians watched this with some amusement. The resulting drink, espresso stretched with water into something longer and smoother, eventually found its way onto cafe menus worldwide under the name that quietly acknowledged its origins. Today, it remains one of the most ordered coffee drinks in North America among people who want espresso flavor without the concentrated punch of a straight shot. Latte. Of all the drinks that came out of the global cafe boom of the 1990s, the latte probably did more than any other to bring espresso culture to people who didn't previously drink coffee. It combines espresso with a generous amount of steamed milk and a thin layer of foam, the milk softening the bitterness into something creamy, mild, and easy to enjoy. Flavored syrups followed almost immediately, and vanilla, caramel, and pumpkin spice became so tied to the latte that the drink became a cultural shorthand for a certain kind of cafe lifestyle. Latte art emerged from the specialty coffee movement as baristas began treating the foam surface as a canvas, a practice that started as craft and eventually became an international competition. Cappuccino. A cappuccino uses the same core ingredients as a latte: espresso, steamed milk, foam, but the proportions shift dramatically. Equal parts of each create a drink lighter, airier, and noticeably more coffee-forward than its milkier cousin. The name traces back to the Capuchin friars, a Catholic religious order whose brown robes matched the color of the drink. In Italy, a cappuccino is firmly a morning beverage. Ordering one afternoon marks you immediately as a tourist, and no self-respecting Italian barista will judge you silently any harder than in that moment. Getting the milk texture right is considered one of the clearest signs of a skilled barista. Flat white. Australia and New Zealand have been arguing about who invented the flat white since at least the 1980s, and neither side shows any sign of giving up. What both countries agree on is the drink itself: espresso with steamed milk, textured to a velvety smoothness, served in a smaller cup than a latte with almost no foam on top. The coffee flavor comes through more clearly than in a latte precisely because there is less milk diluting it. Flat whites remained largely unknown outside the Southern Hemisphere until specialty coffee culture went global, and Starbucks, adding it to their menu in 2015, introduced it to an audience of millions who had never encountered it before. Macchiato. The traditional macchiato is one of the simplest drinks in coffee, just an espresso with a small spoonful of milk foam placed on top. The name means stained or marked in Italian, referring to the way the milk lightly marks the surface of the shot rather than mixing into it. The effect is subtle, a slight softening of the acidity without turning the drink into something milky. In Italian cafes, macchiatos are ordered by people who want their espresso just slightly tamed. What coffee chains later did with the name, building towering sweetened drinks several times the size, has very little to do with the original, which remains one of the most quietly elegant things you can order at a proper espresso bar. Mocha. The mocha takes espresso in a more indulgent direction by adding chocolate, usually as syrup or cocoa powder, before steamed milk is poured in. The result sits somewhere between coffee and hot chocolate, bitter and sweet at the same time, rich enough to feel like a treat. The name has genuine historical weight. It comes from the Yemeni port city of Mocha, once one of the most important coffee trading hubs in the world, where beans were prized for their naturally chocolatey flavor notes. Modern mochas have little connection to Yemen specifically, but the name carried forward as chocolate and coffee became permanently linked in cafe culture. Whipped cream on top is optional in most places and somehow mandatory in others. Cold brew. Cold brew is not iced coffee, and the distinction matters more than most people expect the first time they try them side by side. Iced coffee is simply hot coffee, cooled down and poured over ice. Cold brew is made by steeping grounds slowly in cold water for anywhere between 12 and 24 hours with no heat involved at all. The result is smoother, sweeter, and far less acidic, a completely different drinking experience produced by the same ingredient through a completely different process. During the 2010s, cold brew went from a specialty cafe curiosity to a product sold in gas stations, and some bars started serving it straight from beer taps like a craft IPA. The caffeine content tends to run surprisingly high given how gentle the whole process feels. Cortado. The Cortado comes from Spain, and its name means cut, the way a small amount of steamed milk cuts through the intensity of the espresso without overwhelming it. The ratio is roughly equal parts coffee and milk, placing it somewhere between a macchiato and a flat white in terms of strength. It became a quiet favorite in specialty coffee shops because it preserves the character of the espresso better than larger milk drinks, while being smoother and more approachable than a straight shot. The Cortado rarely announces itself loudly. It tends to be discovered by people who have worked their way through most of the menu and realize they want something in between everything else. Affogato. The Affogato sits in the unusual position of being both a coffee drink and a dessert simultaneously, and it handles both roles without apology. A shot of hot espresso is poured directly over a scoop of vanilla gelato or ice cream, and the two begin dissolving into each other immediately, the bitter heat of the coffee melting into the cold sweetness of the cream. The word means drowned in Italian, describing exactly what happens to the gelato the moment the espresso lands. Despite requiring almost no skill to prepare, affogatos became a fixture in upscale cafes and restaurant dessert menus because they feel elegant in a way that is difficult to explain given how simple they actually are. Turkish coffee. Turkish coffee is one of the oldest brewing methods still in daily use anywhere in the world. Extremely finely ground coffee, closer to powder than grounds, is simmered directly in a small pot called a sezve, along with water and often sugar, then poured into a cup without filtering. The grounds settle at the bottom as you drink, and the unwritten rule is to stop before you reach them. The drink traces back centuries through the Ottoman Empire, where coffee houses became important social institutions long before the concept existed in Europe. In some cultures, the grounds left behind are used to read fortunes, a practice that has survived into the modern day with more sincerity than you might expect. UNESCO recognized Turkish coffee culture as intangible cultural heritage in 2013. Vietnamese Egg Coffee. Vietnamese egg coffee was born out of necessity rather than creativity. In Hanoi, during the 1940s, fresh milk became scarce enough that a bartender named Nguyen Van Giang began whipping egg yolk with sugar and condensed milk as a substitute, then spooning the mixture over strong Vietnamese coffee. The result was unexpectedly rich, thick and custard-like on top, intensely bitter underneath, tasting to most people like a cross between coffee and tiramisu. Van Giang eventually opened his own cafe. His family still operates today in the same Hanoi alley. What started as a wartime improvisation became one of Vietnam's most distinctive culinary exports, drawing tourists specifically to try a drink that most of them cannot quite believe works as well as it does. Dalgona Coffee. Very few drinks in history went from obscurity to global phenomenon as fast as Dalgona Coffee did in early 2020. As lockdowns began around the world, a simple recipe started circulating. Instant coffee, sugar, and hot water whipped together into a thick foam, then spooned over cold milk. Within weeks, it was everywhere, driven almost entirely by people recreating it at home and posting the results. The name came from a South Korean honeycomb candy called Dalgona, whose flavor the whipped coffee supposedly resembled. The drink itself was not new. Versions of it had been made for years in India, Pakistan, and parts of North Africa under different names. But 2020 gave it a global stage at exactly the moment when millions of people had nothing but time and a desperate need for something to make. Irish coffee. Irish coffee was invented in the 1940s by a chef named Joe Sheridan at a small airport restaurant in the west of Ireland. A group of American passengers arrived cold and exhausted after a transatlantic flight was turned back by bad weather, and Sheridan added Irish whiskey to their coffee to warm them up. When one passenger asked whether they were drinking Brazilian coffee, Sheridan told them it was Irish coffee, and the name stuck. The drink combines hot coffee, Irish whiskey, and sugar, with lightly whipped cream floated on top rather than mixed in, so the coffee is sipped cold through the cream. It became one of the most recognizable alcoholic coffee drinks in the world, a reasonable legacy for something invented to comfort stranded travelers on a winter night in County Clare.